What's up everybody, this is Master Ian Gamer. Earlier today we got the full gameplay trailer for the new hero Junker Queen, along with an Overwatch blog post outlining the development process of the Queen and her various abilities, which gives some rather interesting insight into the devs' actual mentality when it came to building this upcoming hero. So in today's video I wanted to go through some of the interesting tidbits we learn in this blog post, as well as take a look at her full kit and how it all works together. But before I get onto that, I just wanted to go ahead and show off the Overwatch 2 redesign for Junkrat, which we saw at long last for the first time in this recent Junker Queen trailer. Yes, this is what Junkrat is going to be looking like in Overwatch 2. I believe he was the last hero for us to get to see his Overwatch 2 design, which means we've now seen all of them. And his new design looks a bit goofy. He's got goggles on, which is pretty cool. And I like the redesign of his rip tire. It almost has a more buzzsaw look to it as opposed to a spiked tire. But yeah, it was nice to finally get a look at what he's going to look like in Overwatch 2. And also, I guess I'll throw up on screen, we got a decent look at Soldier 76 as well, whose Overwatch 2 design we have seen before, but never really in a good, clear spot, at least when it came to his in-game model. Previously, we had the 2D render of him, but now we have in-game what he's going to look like, and he's certainly turned into a gruff old grandpa. But now, getting on to the Junker Queen specifically, let's run through the blog post, covering some of the interesting tidbits that were revealed in it. Junker Queen joins the Overwatch 2 roster as the newest tank hero with a big axe and even bigger ideas. As we saw in the Wastelander cinematic, the Scrapyard Sovereign is fierce, resourceful, and no stranger to survival. And now, she's come to claim her rightful throne. Junker Queen's playstyle and kit were built from pre-existing Overwatch lore. The Junkertown map showcases her tough, almost brutal personality, and we wanted her abilities and playstyle to match that energy. This type of design, constructing a character's kit to match their established identity, is called top-down design. Junker Queen was in Overwatch's narrative well before we had a design for her kit, which meant she had big community expectations resting on her stately shoulders. Now, as she steps out of the lore and into the light, let's jump into the design of her kit and check out how you can expect her to play. So first up, Adrenaline Rush and Scattergun. Adrenaline Rush is the cornerstone to Junker Queen's identity as a tank. The passive ability heals her from all damage over time dealt by wounds. Many of her abilities apply wounds that cause enemies to slowly drain health. This lifesteal ability adds to her survivability and aggression. Pushing the boundaries of brawling, Junker Queen feels more like a berserker tank whose survivability is directly connected to how many enemies she's wounding. All of Junker Queen's abilities encourage her to get up close and personal with her enemies, so we equipped her with a primary fire that fits her playstyle. Scattergun is a pump-action shotgun with a small spread that makes it extra scary at short range. Adrenaline Rush and Scattergun both encourage her to play into enemies while giving her the survivability she needs to make space for her team and fulfill her tank role. Moving on to her first activated ability, Carnage, Junker Queen's character has always been depicted with an axe, so that was the starting point for her design. Carnage consists of a big sweeping swing that wounds all enemies in front of her, dealing damage to them over time. Junker Queen refers to her axe as Carnage, further inspiring the importance of this ability in her kit. We thought her axe might work as a primary weapon, but historically, making a melee hero in Overwatch has come with its own set of challenges. For example, Genji's Jagged Blade used to be his primary weapon, but didn't translate well in-game. In the end, it was transformed into the powerful ultimate players know today. We didn't want to take Junker Queen down a similar path, so we incorporated her axe into this ability. The original iteration of Carnage enabled her to throw her axe following the initial swing, before recalling it back to herself with her magnetic gauntlet. However, when implemented, the practice of throwing her axe felt wrong. It led to a rigid playstyle that didn't allow for the use of other axe-based abilities while her weapon was out of hand, so the throw was swapped to a slash with a damage over time effect. The concept of throwing and recalling her weapon eventually led to her next ability, Jagged Blade. So real quick before I move on to Jagged Blade, basically the sentiment they're sharing here about how they wanted her to be a melee primary weapon type hero, but it just didn't work, is something that I'd kind of suspected even before we had the leaked kit for the Junker Queen. I mean, the anecdote anecdote they shared about Genji and his Dragon Blade is something we've known for a very long time at this point, so the idea of introducing future melee-focused heroes has always been something where I've been rather curious to see if it's something they could manage at some point, or if they're just going to shy away from that entirely. So I think it's interesting at the very least that the Junker Queen was yet another hero where they, to some extent at least, considered making her primary weapon just the melee axe, but ultimately shied away in favor of the shotgun, which I'm sure is probably the better choice to go with in terms of balance. Also, another interesting detail is how they talk about that the axe used to be able to be thrown, like how her Jagged Blade ends up working now, and we can actually see this in one of her highlight intros that they've shown off, where she summons the camera in towards her by pulling in her axe with her magnetic gauntlet, but she doesn't actually throw her axe. So when I first saw this, I was like, that's sort of weird. Why is she throwing and recalling her axe in the highlight intro as opposed to her knife? But now I'm wondering if this highlight intro specifically is like a remnant of her original character design and how she used to throw the axe. Interesting little detail to take note of there. Moving on to the next ability though, Jagged Blade. Jagged Blade is Junker Queen's secondary fire and comes with both active and passive abilities. The active ability triggers when you press secondary fire, causing her to throw the knife in her offhand. Her knife, which the Queen calls Gracie, applies a wound that causes damage over time if she lands a direct hit on the enemy. Her magnetic gauntlet can then recall the knife by reactivating secondary fire. Recalling Gracie will pull any enemies that have been directly hit or happen to find themselves in the knife's recall path into Junker Queen. Be wary of your surroundings. If you're struck by Gracie, you're headed straight for the Queen. Jagged Blade isn't the first time the team has experimented with throwing a weapon. When Reinhardt was first prototyped, he was able to throw his hammer into the enemy team, an ability that was cool in theory, but awkward in practice, requiring him to go pick up his hammer to defend his team anytime he threw it. Despite not making it into Reinhardt's final kit, this prototype ability heavily inspired Jagged Blade. Throwing a weapon made more sense for Junker Queen, who possesses a special magnetic gauntlet that she can use to pull things around her. We didn't want the gauntlet to make her feel too magey or similar to Sigma, who can lift people up and throw them around. Instead, Junker Queen uses her magnetic powers to control her axe and knife as a vicious means to serve her brutal ends. To make her even more intimidating up close, Jagged Blade's passive ability wounds enemies when using quick melee while the knife is in her hands. These abilities that apply wounds all serve her life leech passive, Adrenaline Rush. Now, the tidbit they mentioned here about Reinhardt and how he used to throw his hammer is amazing. I don't think that's something we ever knew previously, that was something they experimented with Reinhardt doing. Although, funnily enough, we do actually see Baldrich in Reinhardt's animated short throw one of the hammers when fighting off the Omnics inside Eichenwald. So now I have to wonder if the idea in the animated short for throwing the hammer in this way was actually inspired by this original idea for Reinhardt. Again, just a funny little tidbit of information that I don't think we ever knew before, but is really funny to look at in retrospect. And who knows, maybe Reinhardt could end up getting a PvE talent at some point where he can throw out his hammer and then either summon it back to himself like the Queen does, or have it return some other way, because that just sounds like such a fun idea for Reinhardt, just throwing his giant hammer at people. But moving on to the next ability for the Junker Queen, Commanding Shout. To enhance her tankiness, Junker Queen is equipped with Commanding Shout, an ability that heightens her own survivability while also helping her teammates around her, increasing the health and movement speed of both herself and nearby allies. As the first team movement speed buff since Lucio, Commanding Shout helps Junker Queen close the gap between her and the enemy team. Her ability to close distance was designed as a movement speed buff rather than something sneaky like a short dash or teleport. This helps reinforce her nature as someone who sprints headfirst into battle with a booming roar. She brute forces her way through her opposition with a relentless aggression that demands space. It furthers her effectiveness to take charge and lead her team into battle through tight choke points or against flanking enemies. Now, before I move on to her ultimate, I will just mention that Commanding Shout is a very interesting ability, especially for a tank hero, because as they say, yeah, it's just a speed boost and also gives some temporary health as well to herself and her entire team, which is honestly pretty powerful. I'm really curious to actually start playing the Junker Queen and see how this ability ties into her effectiveness, because it seems like such a strong mechanic to give to a tank hero. That's not me saying that I think it's going to be overpowered or anything like that at this point, but it just feels like such a unique ability to give a tank hero specifically, such that I'm curious to see how it ends up interacting with other elements of the game. But moving on now to her ultimate ability, Rampage. Rampage is Junker Queen's ultimate. It charges her forward, grievously wounds enemies, and prevents them from healing. It's the first ability since Ana's Biotic Grenade to apply an anti-heal. Paired with Adrenaline Rush, Rampage is one of Junker Queen's strongest survivability assets. It applies a deadly wound to anyone in its path, giving her the potential to restore a significant amount of health with Adrenaline Rush, depending on the number of wounds she manages to apply. Initially, her ultimate was a spinning whirlwind type ability, but we wanted to incorporate her magnetic gauntlet into her ultimate. We didn't want it to feel elegant or magic influenced either, because it didn't align well conceptually with her character, so we tried to push her magnetic gauntlet to its limits. Rampage charges her gauntlet and creates a cloud with her knife and axe around her while she charges into the enemy team. It's a display of the raw visceral power she possesses as queen. There's then a little closing paragraph where they just talk about how she was designed to fit specifically in 5v5 from her very conception, and how she's going to be much more brawly and all that, so nothing else too significant to read through here. One comment I do have about Rampage though is I'm somewhat skeptical of the anti-heal aspect of Rampage. Again, we haven't played her for ourselves yet, so I'm not going to say Rampage having this anti-heal is broken or OP or anything, but at least on paper, it does feel like a weird aspect to give her ultimate. Like, I get the big sweeping whirlwind lunging forward with all her weapons and having it wound the enemies she hits, but the anti-heal aspect just feels like an odd sort of thing that's just like tacked on. Like, just reading the ability and the fact that it has this effect doesn't make it sound like it really fits well in terms of her kit, where I just don't understand exactly the exact synergy it has with the other elements in her ability set. I mean, sure, anti-heal is always a powerful debuff to put on the enemy team, but why does it necessarily need to be on her ultimate? Couldn't they have just left out the anti-heal and then made the ult charge for Rampage lower so she could use it more often? I don't really know. I mean, again, we'll have to play her for ourselves to actually see how it feels and if it seems like it's a good fit for a debuff to have on her ultimate, but personally, when it just comes to reading through the abilities, Rampage having anti-heal just seems like an odd, kind of random effect that they've just tacked onto the ability. Maybe it'll end up feeling good, maybe it'll just feel sort of off, but either way, I'm interested to see how it plays, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this in the comments down below. Are you excited to finally get to play the Junker Queen in this upcoming beta? Or maybe you have some reservations about different elements of her kit? Either way, I'd love to hear from you, and as always, be sure to subscribe, follow me on Twitter, hit up that bell icon, and come join my Discord server to hang out and never miss any of my future Overwatch content. Special thanks to my YouTube channel members who help make these videos possible, and if you'd like to join them to earn some cool rewards, then just hit that join button down below. Otherwise, this is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.